Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. Returning to the program today is dear friend of the magazine, Matt McManus. He is a lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan, the author of The Political Right and Equality, as well as the new book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, about which we are here to talk to him today. I think that was grammatical. Matt McManus, welcome to Current Affairs.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's great to be here. Love the magazine, and I've been loving some of the stuff that you've been pushing out recently, especially, so keep up the good work.
Oh, thanks very much. Well, you know, you and I have co-written things for the magazine that we've been proud of, too, and I think we've discussed at least one or two of those on the program before. But today we're here to talk about your book on liberal socialism. Now, the reason I'm grateful for your book on liberal socialism is that you are a political theorist, you are a political philosopher, and I studied political philosophy as an undergrad. And I remember going to these classes, and in many ways it was very exciting for me because in high school I'd learned history, I'd learned geography, I'd learned math, but I'd never gotten to think in the classroom about issues of justice, issues of the good. Philosophy was kind of exciting for me. And political philosophy, thinking about the correct organization of a state and what gives a state its legitimacy, and how do we, to what extent is it necessary or obligatory for a citizen to follow the law? These were kind of exciting questions for me to be able to think deeply about in an academic setting. But as I grew older and looked back on my political philosophy education, I realized that it never really touched on issues of economic justice at all. We talked in the classic political philosophers, we're all talking about the state, the individual's relationship to the state, but not too much. In fact, I don't think we ever discussed, and the universities are considered very radical places, but we didn't discuss how socialism fits into political philosophy. But you, Matt McManus, as a political philosopher, believe that we do have to confront the question of what does political philosophy have to say about issues of socialism and capitalism? How does liberalism mesh with or not mesh with socialism? So orient us a little bit as to where in the existing framework of political philosophy your intervention is kind of coming in.
Sure, absolutely. So I think a lot of socialists are quite wary of political philosophy, and rightly so, because political philosophers, at least in the Anglo-American world, haven't paid that much attention to socialism as a distinct tradition until, I should say, quite recently. And fortunately, there's a growing number of political philosophers, including very serious people like Elizabeth Anderson or David Leigh Williams, that are taking issues of economic inequality and power, or the social democratic and socialist traditions much more seriously. Actually, Liz Anderson, in a really good book she wrote, Hijacked, on the neoliberal work ethic, pointed out, look, there's this very rich tradition of democratic socialism and social democracy that has had a profound influence on world politics over the last 150 years, and we know very little about its foundational figures. So my book was a small effort to try to introduce people to a couple of important thinkers on the liberal socialism nexus that had something to say about issues of economic equality, class power, domination in the economy, all those things. And what I think becomes really clear in my book is that many of the great minds of the Western canon, certainly that conservatives love to revere time and time again, were very, very concerned with issues of economic inequality, class domination, etc. And as Leigh Williams points out in his book on equality, especially economic inequality, these concerns go all the way back to Plato, right? Plato, so beloved by many on the right, once insisted that a good society, this was in the laws, should not have inequalities of wealth that are any more than 4 times higher than the poorest person. Why?
What's average CEO pay at now in America?
Yeah, exactly. And interestingly enough, Plato held these for what we might consider conservative reasons. He said, look, the more inequality you have, the more disorder you're going to have, because the more people are going to be deeply unhappy and not see themselves as being part of the same community. So you got to have economic equality to have order and community. My work takes place a lot later. So I really start with thinkers in the 17th and 18th century, around the time when liberalism and socialism were just starting to come on the map. And the book explores the relationship between these two complicated traditions. And one of the things that I point out is very often liberalism and socialism are sharply juxtaposed, even presented as mortal enemies. And, I'm sure you've encountered this whenever you read like Tom Sowell or something like that, right? Liberalism is for individualism, at least classical liberalism, whereas socialism is for collectivism and authoritarianism and totalitarianism and all those bad things. And what I'd like to point out in the book is that actually it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing to note here for people who are not familiar with this kind of discourse is that when you use the term liberalism and you say that Thomas Sowell is an advocate of liberalism, some people might be right. Some people might be confused because obviously in America we talk about liberals and conservatives, and liberals are Democrats are liberals and Republicans are conservatives, and Thomas Sowell is obviously not a liberal in the colloquial sense of when you identify yourself on your political affiliation on Facebook, and you have to say, and the four options are very conservative, I think like centrist, liberal, or very liberal. And so I think it may be necessary to ground people who have not in the peculiar way in which and the many meanings of the word liberalism here.
Sure, absolutely. So I should say, I'm Canadian, and where I come from, the political term liberal as a kind of label has a somewhat different meaning than the United States. And I never quite understood why many progressives and why many conservatives hold liberals in such disdain until I moved here. And then I realized, there's this kind of personality, the Matt Yglesias personality, to reference your article, that basically just thinks that like whatever an upper middle class New Yorker thinks is the appropriate moral way to organize society is just self-evidently the right way to organize society. And anyone who thinks otherwise is just a boob. And I think that could not be more wrong.
Wait, and there's the Phil Oakes song, Love Me, I'm a Liberal, which famously sort of pokes fun at the fecklessness and hypocrisy of American liberals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to make very clear, I'm not apologizing for any of that. If anything, my book is very critical of just those kind of personalities. But what I'm talking about is more what we might call philosophical liberalism, as a distinct tradition that you could trace all the way back if you want to Stoicism, various versions of Christianity, even Buddhism, if you really wanted to, but which emerged as a distinct doctrine in arguably the 17th century. Some people would say as late as the 19th century, but I think that's pushing it a little bit too far. And one of the things that characterized these early liberal thinkers was their rejection of older ways of thinking about nature and thinking about society, which held that nature and society are both fundamentally hierarchical, and the hierarchy is not to be questioned because it's either natural or it's set by God or some combination of the two. And, I don't want to give too many examples because we'll be here forever, but you can look at people like Aristotle, for example. Aristotle, as Leo Strauss pointed out in his book, The City and Man, held to this idea that, look, there are just fundamental inequalities between people. Men are smarter than women. Most women are smarter than the average slave, and society should be organized to reflect these fundamental inequities between people. Or you can look at Robert Filmer, who John Locke got into a big dispute with. Filmer said, look, the family is a hierarchical unit. There's the father at the head, and then the children and the wife at the bottom. Society is a hierarchy also, with the king, who's kind of like a father, at the top, and his children, the citizens or subjects, really, at the bottom. And nature is a hierarchy ordained by God, because God is really the biggest daddy there is, and everyone else is beneath him and should obey.
People might have seen those pictures of the great chain of being. The hierarchy of. In fact, we parodied it at Current Affairs once. The levels of where everything has its place, and everyone has its place in the hierarchy.
That's exactly it. And Charles Taylor, who's a philosopher like Canadian, said we should see this kind of social vision as one of hierarchical complementarity, basically a pyramid, right? Everyone has their place, and everyone needs each other. It's not like, the best philosophers of antiquity said the top of the pyramid doesn't need the bottom of the pyramid. But clearly those who are at the top of the pyramid are entitled to more of basically everything, more agency, more power, more status, definitely a lot more wealth. That's for sure, right? You can run the gamut of it. And liberals really challenged that in an inadequate way, certainly in the 17th century, by insisting, no, actually it's the case that all men, that's an important word,
right,
are created equal. in the eyes of God, certainly, but also in nature, in the state of nature. And consequently, there's a growing push to suggest that it's actually inequalities in society that need to be explained because they're a deviation from the norm, which isn't to say that liberals didn't think there are reasons you could give for those inequalities. But you can't just presume that inequality is the natural state of affairs when they thought that it wasn't. And I argue in the book that if you want to cash out the moral commitments of liberalism in a slogan, I don't think you can do a much better job than the French revolutionaries did in the 18th century, where they said that fundamentally liberals are committed to liberty, equality, and fraternity or solidarity. Although, as I point out in the book, fraternity and solidarity is one that people have spent, certainly in the United States, a lot less time thinking through than they probably should. Although liberal socialists definitely will think through that a lot.
Yeah. Well, we recently had on Astor Taylor and Leah Hunt Hendricks to talk about their book Solidarity, where they talk about this kind of the missing third strand of thought, and that they trace the evolution of the concept of solidarity in particular, and it's really kind of an interesting alternate history of ideas.
That's cool. I'll have to pick that up actually.
Yeah. So it's just the history of the concept of solidarity. So I think you're drawing our attention to the fact that all men are created equal is, in its own way, even if it is enunciated by hypocrites, as indeed it was, is a radical doctrine, and is then we should understand that the degree to which that represents the departure, a departure from a different way of thinking. I recall that when I read the Bell Curve by Charles Murray and Richard Hartstein, one of the things in their final chapter is they say, we believe that one of the things that they argue is that there are all these natural IQ differences that can't be fixed, that people aren't created equal. And they say we need to go back to an older political tradition, the one in which everyone had their place. And they reject this kind of idea of meritocracy because they say, well, there are all these natural inequalities. You can't get rid of them. You have to accept the order that is handed down from nature. And they explicitly say this is an older way of thinking. We need to resuscitate this and return to it because liberalism is based on a kind of faulty premise that people are equal.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you can see thinkers on the right make variations of this argument all the time in more or less radical form, right? Murray and Herrnstein are a great example of that, right? In the Bell Curve, they explicitly say, as you point out, that they are appealing to an older and wiser, is the term they use, tradition, which holds that they, and I point to Aristotle as one example, that says, look, people are just differentially abled and more or less worthy, as it were, and society should reflect this because it's natural or even providential. And these efforts, they think, by well-meaning liberals to try to change these immutable hierarchies is just going to lead to nothing if you adopt the futility thesis at best, or them producing an awful lot of problems at worst. And I think that that's complete bullshit, right? If anything, one of the reasons conservatives get so intensely hostile to efforts on the left and by liberals is precisely that we have been very successful at challenging hierarchies of all sorts, certainly unjustified hierarchies since the revolutionary era, right? We challenged aristocratic hierarchies, we challenged gender hierarchies, we challenged hierarchies of sexual orientation. Democracy and basic rights are very much an achievement of this era. And in many ways, the struggle for economic democracy and freedom from economic domination is a continuation of that very basal struggle, as some of the more insightful right-wing thinkers like Nietzsche and Heidegger well understood.
I recently used in an article the classic phrase, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, by which is meant that those, like, for example, Thomas Jefferson, we can accuse him of a great number of hideous misdeeds in the practice of slavery and the sexual exploitation of those in his possession. On the other hand, the enunciation of a principle, even if you're a hypocrite, the fact that you lay down a principle means that you know that there is some good, and the principles that were laid down by early, even hypocritical liberals ultimately were able to be wielded against them. I mean, if you're in a society where people are enslaved, and there is no common orienting principle in the society where if you ask what the justification for slavery is, people say, well, it's the natural order of things. Who are you to argue with the natural order of things? That's it. But the moment that the moment you've established that principle, all men are created equal, you open up the possibility of going, well, what about this? This doesn't conform to that. And then immediately it becomes, it puts those who are defending hierarchical institutions on the back foot. They have to come up with some justification. Whereas in this other society, they don't even have to come up with a justification. It's like self-justifying. This is the natural order of things. And then, of course, you've laid down the principle. And so then women could say, well, hang on a minute. Why is it that only all men are created equal? Aren't all women part of humanity too? And so, you point to the kind of the seed of radicalism that is within just the establishment of basic liberal principles, even if one is hypocritical about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that the most gifted leftists have been really talented at for a long time. I'll just give two examples, one a little older and one modern. Let's take Frederick Douglass's classic speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." Now, this speech always makes me angry whenever I think about it, because I remember Charlie Kirk tried to bastardize Douglass's legacy back in 2020 by implying that he was somehow a conservative. And in this speech, he mostly said nice things about America. And it is true that in the opening of "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," Douglass has quite a lot of nice things to say about the principles embodied in, let's say, the Declaration of Independence. And he has nice things to say about the revolutionaries that fought for the principles established in the Declaration of Independence. But then immediately he goes on to say, look, why should the slaves care about that? Because this is a profoundly hypocritical nation, if any ways without equal in the world, precisely because Americans preach a commitment to freedom and equality, and keep, at that point, millions of people, by the end, 4 million people in chains. There's something that is just profoundly ugly about that. Douglass is very eloquent on this point. But then at the conclusion of the speech, he says, it's not that the principles that the American revolutionaries fought for are bad. It's just that we've never lived up to them. Indeed, the revolutionaries that defended those principles never really lived up to them, and maybe we should. What a bewildering idea, right? And I think that Douglass was absolutely right to press for that in the 19th century. And I think anybody outside of Curtis Yarvin would probably agree with that today, right? Now, more recently, you have Liz Anderson, who I mentioned recently.
Who's been on this program to discuss her book, Private Governments.
Yeah, great. That's exactly the book I was going to reference, right? She's a phenomenal thinker, and by and large, from what I've heard, a very nice person. And in Private Government, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but she says, look, if you were to go to any red-blooded American and say, do you think it's okay for the government to tell you when to wake up, where you're going to go every day, when you're going to have lunch, who you're going to contact, what you're going to wear, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there'd be a revolution instantly, right? People would be getting out all those "Don't Tread on Me" flags and saying, give me liberty or give me death. And rightly so, if the government tried to do that. However, she points out that we allow economic actors and bosses to do that to us every single day. And nobody thinks about it because, as Marx pointed out in Das Kapital, all these highfalutin liberal commitments to freedom, equality, et cetera, fall by the wayside as long as people cross into the factory floor, or in the modern parlance, just go to work for the day. And Anderson says, look, we should just extend these principles that we already claim to believe them to an area of life, the economy, where most of us are going to spend plenty of our waking hours, if not the majority of our waking hours anyway. Seems pretty commonsensical to me, and I think she's absolutely right to call for that in Private Government and elsewhere.
Yeah, and so in that way, socialism is an attempt to extend these principles of liberalism, of the freedom of individuals, to the economic sphere, which has been sort of ignored and neglected. And interestingly, one of the things that you do in this book that I think is very important, that you kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, is that you take people who, in a political philosophy education such as I had in 2009, would not have been discussed as people who thought about the justice of economic relationships. And you point out that in many ways they did think about this. The person I'm thinking of is John Stuart Mill, because we were assigned his famous tract on liberty, where he makes his case for why it's so important to have freedom of speech and what the boundaries of the freedom that each individual should get are, and the protection that we should have from one another's intrusions, and where the sphere of individual liberty goes. But you open the book with a quote from his autobiography, I believe, where you talk about that. I mean, he thought deeply about socialism and capitalism, and in fact, came down kind of on the side of socialism, even though he's presented as this libertarian thinker.
Yeah, and I should say, as late as the mid-2000s, you could read books on Mill that presented him as a unapologetic defender of free market, usually drawing on his early works, and never even acknowledged this. And the conspiratorial part of me sometimes think that there might be reasons for that, right? But, it's a different era now, and we're very fortunate for that. So if people are interested in this question, I'd really recommend reading my good friend Helen McCabe's great book, John Stuart Mill, Socialist, where I drew a lot of the inspiration for this chapter. But like you mentioned, Mill, in his autobiography, actually takes great pride, as he puts it, in learning to see further than he did in his youth, when he still was narrowly constrained by the categories of what we could call capitalist approaches to political economy. And in that same autobiography, he proudly identifies under, as he put it, the general designation of socialists. Now, Mill has his own understanding of what socialism is, as any great thinker does. It was very centered around what we might call a kind of market socialism, where there would still be competitive firms, but they would be owned by workers and managed by workers. And Mill says this would be an improvement on capitalism because, by and large, the capitalists don't really contribute all that much, he thought, to the management of firms. They bring a little bit of technical know-how and expertise that's useful and would have to be replaced, but nothing that the workers couldn't do for themselves, since they're the ones who actually know how to produce most of the stuff and know how it works a lot better than the capitalists do. And Mill also thought, and this is where he gets really liberal, that not only would it be economically efficient to move towards a cooperative economy, it would be morally uplifting in a liberal way, because Mill, I think very rightly, points out, look, liberals are committed to this idea that a society characterized by subordination is a really bad one, right? This idea that you have to look up to someone and that somebody can look down on you is not a good one. That's what liberals fought against the aristocracy to eliminate. And he said, there's something that is very, very similar to this slavish attitude when people go into the workplace because they have to brown nose to the boss and do whatever the boss tells them to, and the boss has a lot of power over their life. And that's undignified. He thought that it would be a much more almost kind of manly society if workers were to run things for themselves without having to kowtow to a bunch of people who, just because they inherited daddy's factory, got to tell everyone else what to do. And there are a lot more arguments that he gives for his kind of socialism, including arguments for a pretty generous welfare state by 19th century standards, though I think we'd want to go further today. But, it's a very kind of a progressive vision in a lot of ways, although there were definitely problems with it, not least Mill's support of imperialism, which I talk about in the book a bit.
Hi, sorry to interrupt, but if you like this video, please subscribe to this channel for more wonderful current affairs material in the future, and head to currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine today. As I understand it, and we need to be careful here not to get too political philosophy inside baseball, but as I understand it, another of the figures that I was assigned as an undergraduate as one of the great leading lights of political philosophy, John Rawls, has sort of had the same kind of misrepresentation of his ultimate conclusions, because my kind of vague takeaway from John Rawls was that he was almost a justifier of neoliberalism, the idea that as long as you had a very rudimentary welfare state, huge inequalities could be justified. Because, to not have these inequalities would make everyone worse off, and we're better off when we have. That's kind of the impression. And as I understand it, this is wrong, and he too was more sympathetic to a robust social democracy or kind of democratic socialism than that comes across in this presentation of the ideas.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I also don't want to get too insider baseball in this. But, when I was taught Rawls in my undergrad, and I had a really good teacher, right? This wasn't done insincerely. More or less, Rawls was presented as the defender of a kind of modest welfare state, the kind of welfare state you'd see under the Johnson administration. At best, maybe something like a version of Nordic social democracy or Western social democracy. And interestingly enough, Rawls actually explicitly repudiated that interpretation of his work in his last book, Justice, Fairness, and Restatement, where he says, look, obviously, a kind of robust welfare state would be a big improvement on where the United States is going right now, precisely in that neoliberal direction. But it still permits enormous inequalities in wealth that are not compatible with my principles. And worse, he pointed out, one of the problems with these enormous inequalities in wealth is how they translate to enormous inequalities in power. Something we really should be thinking about in our new oligarchy, right? Because this basic liberal idea of equal citizenship for all is really contravened by the concentrations of power that emerge from hyper-concentrations of wealth. So Rawls said, really the only kind of just liberal society is something that he called a property-owning democracy, which is basically this kind of Jeffersonian idea of us all being very small-scale property owners with more or less the same amount of stuff, right? Small scale set, or liberal socialism is the other regime that he proposed. Now, he never really gave a lot of detail about what either of these would look like because he died, sadly. But there's a few hints in his lectures on Marx, which themselves are telling, where Rawls opens his lectures on Marx by saying, Marx was a world historical genius, the master of several disciplines. There's all kinds of things that we still have to learn from him, and it's deeply disappointing that people don't want to seem to learn from him. Now, obviously, Rawls think that Marx made some mistakes, and I think we all agree that Marx made some mistakes. I know that you feel that way too. But in those lectures, he actually sketches out a liberal socialist model and says this is a very admirable vision, and it's one that should be centered around this idea again of the democratization of the economy, extraordinarily robust redistributive mechanisms to provide social services to the poor and the needy until there are no poor and needy any longer, along, of course, with protection for standard liberal rights to things like freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's a very attractive vision, although I also point out in the book that there are problems with the ways that Rawls approaches this.
You quote, I'm sure that a lot of socialists were irritated by your defense of quote-unquote liberal socialism, because we as socialists often have a if we were raised with the Phil Oakes notion of the liberal, we react as a vampire to the garlic clove when we hear the word liberalism, because we spend all of our time defending leftism against liberalism. And you quote one of the criticisms that can be made as being that historically actually existing liberalism, those who we would put into this tradition, the hypocrisy is not incidental but fundamental. And I think you quote Lucerdo here in the opening, where you say, for this perspective, the contradictions in liberalism were stamped by the needs of capital and power at any given time. And it wasn't an accident that someone like John Stuart Mill was okay with the British Empire, for instance. And liberalism must be understood as paradoxically committed to liberty for some, while accepting or even defending servitude and subordination for others. So how in defending, in saying that we should embrace this concept of liberalism, how is it that you reject this idea that a distinction between those who deserve the freedom and those don't is kind of fundamental to what liberalism has always been?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to make clear, I characterize my book as a retrieval, not a defense. And the term retrieval is one coined by the great Canadian thinker C.B. Macpherson, himself a socialist, author of a neat book called The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism. And the reason I call it a retrieval, not a defense, is I think this liberal socialism is a tradition that's worth retrieving and thinking through and thinking with. And later on, I'd like to defend it, and I will right here. But it has lots of problems, right? And there's a reason that it failed, not least for the reasons that Lucerdo brings up in his book on liberalism. So here I want to say that I think it's important to note that there are different flavors of liberalism, some of which are much more comfortable with forms of authoritarianism and domination, so long as that's in the service of capital, than others. So in many ways, the main villain of the book is Ludwig von Mises, right? Who some people might be familiar with. He was the author of a classic book in the 1920s called Liberalism, where he actually, ironically, sounds a bit like a Marxist, where he says, when you boil liberalism down, its central principle is a commitment to private property, that is, private ownerships of the means of production. All the other central demands of liberalism flow from this commitment to private property. And in many cases, when von Mises, or for that matter, Hayek, were confronted with regimes that did not show protection for property, even if they were democratic regimes, like say what happened in Chile, then they would invariably say, no, protection of property and protection of capital is more important to our flavor of liberalism than the protection of what we'd even consider other basic liberal rights, like the right to vote, like the right to have a say in your government, et cetera, et cetera. And that's species of liberalism, whether you want to call it Austrian liberalism or neoliberalism, we can have a chat about that later. I have nothing but an enormous amount of criticism for, because I don't think that it sincerely represents the best of the liberal tradition. And I think even from a purely liberal standpoint, buying into some of these ideas and taking them far too seriously is one of the reasons why liberals have become so profoundly unattractive to many populations around the world today. Sam Moyne wrote a really good book about this and the kind of depravities of Cold War liberalism. The liberal socialist tradition that I talk about, things are a little bit more complicated. Everyone from Mary Wollstonecraft through Mill, through Charles Mill, the great black radical liberal, so-called, and Rawls, thought it was very important to try to make their liberalism much more sensitive to the needs to secure freedom for everyone, especially the poor. But I argue in the book that they were still very limited by their failure to understand the nature of capitalism as a global system of domination, or a global system of totality, if you want to use the Marxist term. And so for liberal socialism to kind of have a shot at being a viable political theory in the future, it's going to need to internalize a lot better, or a lot richer, an understanding of things like power, domination, the way economic elites operate in order to protect their interests against even very pronounced citizens' movements. And so in the future, I'm hoping that if people like the book or interested in the book, they'll take this step forward to try to solve a lot of the problems that were inherent within classical liberal socialism.
I think that you have identified so far how a liberal socialist might be distinguished from a non-socialist liberal. That is to say, a liberal who values individual equality, civil liberties, democracy, etc., but who also understands that you need to extend your analysis to all of the domains in which power operates. That person goes from being a liberal to being a liberal socialist, as John Stuart Mill did when he opened his eyes, and as John Rawls did. I think the other half of it is what distinguishes a liberal socialist from a non-liberal socialist, because not all socialists are liberal socialists. So now we have to turn to the socialist tradition in thought and understand a little better why, who the liberal socialists are and who the others who are not that are, and why someone like Bernstein is a liberal socialist, and why someone like, I assume, Lenin or is not a liberal socialist.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I point out at the beginning of the book is liberalism and socialism are both very large families, right? It makes more sense, I think, to call people like Alan Ryan or Michael Friedman talk about liberalisms, plural, or socialisms, plural. And just like any other family, there's going to be shared characteristics, shared kind of commitments that they have. But just like you probably have members of your family that you don't particularly get along with, you might even wonder, like, how the fuck are we related? So too, it's shared. Yes. Yeah, any family reunion. My Christmas wasn't that long ago. It kind of comes really to the fore. And, this is kind of the way I think of, feel when I read people like Hayek or von Mises, who are very smart guys, let's be clear. But I'm kind of like, how exactly do we share the same kind of label as someone like me who likes John Stuart Mill or John Rawls? Now, on the socialist end of things, I think there are a wide array of different socialist doctrines. So some socialists were very clearly committed to this idea that a commitment to socialism entailed a commitment to basic liberal rights, excluding, of course, a very expansive right to private ownership of the means of production, precisely because all liberal socialists or socialists with liberal inclinations recognize that private ownership of the means of production was incompatible with other basic liberal principles to things like equality, non-domination in the economy, that kind of thing. And I think there are very good reasons to accept this view. But obviously, there are plenty of socialists who think that actually real socialism or a commitment to their version of socialism will require abandoning a commitment to basic liberal rights. Now, this is a complicated question, but very often the kind of two sources that are drawn upon are Marx's On the Jewish Question, where he offers a pretty severe criticism of liberal rights, and the Communist Manifesto, where there's this argument put forward for a kind of democratic centralism, or if you want to use the more ominous term, a dictatorship of the proletariat that's not going to be limited by the kind of constraints on power that a liberal would think are very important because of the necessity of dividing power up, right? And I point out that there's a complicated story, and I'd have to spend more time writing about it to really flesh it out, that if you read the works of Marx carefully, we'll just use him as an example, I don't think that you can support the view that at least Marx would be committed to a fundamentally illiberal version of socialism, the way that many Marxist-Leninists or Stalinists think. And, I provide some textual evidence for this. Just let's go back to On the Jewish Question. In On the Jewish Question, it's very clear that Marx is being critical of the rights of man because he thinks that they are inadequate to the full realization of human freedom. And I think any socialist would agree with him. But he certainly is not saying that the rights of man should be discarded on that basis, or that the rights of man don't constitute an improvement on aristocratic society. If anything, Marx spent a lot of his early life defending things like freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc., etc. So he seemed pretty committed to them. They just didn't go far enough and needed to be sublated into a higher order. Or you can move forward to the critique of the Gotha program, where Marx says, look, actually, this idea that we are going to have some fundamental break with liberalism in a transition to a socialist society is ahistorical and utopian. There's this idea that you could have almost a millenarian break in year one, the way that far too many socialists assumed that they could. Marx instead says any new socialist society that you create is going to look a lot more like what Bhaskar talks about in the Socialist Manifesto, especially the chapters on 5 minutes after capitalism. Marx says that a new socialist society is going to be very stamped, that's his term, by features of the old one, which is going to include liberal institutions, liberal rights, probably liberal legal systems, and it's only going to be over a very long period of time that we might be able to discard some of that and move towards a communist society that advances under the banner of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So when Leninists and Stalinists and some other socialists suggest that there's something illegitimate about liberal socialism from a Marxist standpoint, I'm very tempted to push back against that by suggesting that, no, Marx actually seemed to have pretty complicated views on this. Now, I'm not trying to imply that Marx himself was a liberal in any way, shape, or form. He clearly wasn't. But I also don't think that he would be dismissive of the importance of liberalism and of liberal rights the way that some socialists can be.
Just to conclude here, let me ask you about the stakes of the discussion. And you mentioned, we now live in a country in which it's very clear that billionaires are not just incredibly wealthy, but incredibly powerful.
You don't say.
Within the state, and in the workplace, and across every domain of society. And I think we're coming to understand that, which makes sense why you have to have some kind of understanding of economic power if you're going to have any discussions about the justice of and domination and any of these things that we want to talk about, these big issues that we want to talk about in political philosophy. I want to ask you, what is it? Why is it you've written a whole book on liberal socialism in order to try and clarify our ideas? Why do you think it's so important to think clearly about liberalism and socialism? Why should we wrestle with these ideas in the here and now?
Yeah, of course, that's very much in the spirit of the conclusion of the book. Before I answer that question, I do want to say I do think there is one reason to be optimistic about our current oligarchic moment. Which is
love to hear it.
It's a very small silver lining, so runs against my usual pessimism. Just to be a bit of an upper for a second. If you looked at Trump's transition to power, an enormous amount of conservatives were talking about how this was sticking it to the elite, sticking it to the globalists, sticking it to the ruling class. I even saw that term. Now, I think all of that is ridiculous for the reasons that you just mentioned, right? Electing a billionaire president to power so he can pass tax cuts for his extremely wealthy friends like Elon Musk is not sticking it to power in any meaningful way. But I do think that the fact that almost every American now seems to acknowledge that there is a ruling elite and that there is a class structure to society, even conservatives, is a big advance on what we saw in the 1980s and the 1990s, when we were told 1,000 times a day that America and Canada were not class societies, everybody was middle class, and fundamentally we should just drop all this awareness of these kinds of issues. So it's a very small silver lining, but I think that germ of awareness that's finally starting to sprout on everyone's part might be a promising sign for us going forward, right? Just again, to be glass half full for a few seconds. In terms of why I think liberal socialism in particular is important, it's actually in part for just these reasons, right? I think that if you're going to try to argue for changing a country or radically changing it, we need to be radicals in the proper sense of the word. The term radical is from the Latin radix, meaning rooted, right? So you need to kind of draw your radicalism from the soil in which you're embedded. And I think that a lot of Americans, even many on the right, have a deep attraction to plenty of aspects of the liberal tradition. Its emphasis on things like freedom, its emphasis on things like equality, and its emphasis on things like a society with no masters, right? And what we need to do is make the case to many Americans that socialism, far from contravening our commitment to these principles, is taking them more seriously than we ever have before. Because if you really want to have a society that is free, then you shouldn't be ruled over by bosses, let alone by oligarchs, including the richest man in the world, who apparently just thinks that he can buy elections now. If you really want to be committed to equality, then, well, that should also entail a commitment to quite a large amount of economic equality, because if there are going to be these stark disparities in terms of wealth, those are inevitably going to translate into disparities in power. And if people are committed to community, like a lot of Americans absolutely are, I would always say, what more can we do for our community than making sure that millions, if not hundreds of millions of our fellow citizens have access to things like Medicare, basic social services, mat leave and paternity leave for people who want to be parents, you name it, right? So to quote Michael Moore, I don't think that socialist principles are not American principles or not liberal principles. I think that they are as American as they come, and we just need to make our case to the public that that's the right way to understand them.
Well, I have to say to our listeners and readers that your book on liberal socialism, the political theory of liberal socialism, is a book that will make you smarter. You will know more at the end than you came in. I think, I also would make the case that in order to act in the world, we have to think. We have to think about our ideas and what we stand for, what our principles are. One of the things that was so exciting to me as an undergrad about political philosophy was that I felt, when I encountered it, like I had been, up until that point, acting upon instinct. I had had a kind of instinctual revulsion at perceived injustices, but it challenged me to think, well, why is it? What makes an injustice an injustice? Are you being inconsistent here? Are you applying your what is your root principle, and how are you applying it? And what kinds of institutions would conform to your principles, and what kinds would deviate from it? And And I think learning to think that way is it's just so crucial if you're going to take any action that actually improves the world. And so, that's the practical case for why it is. These are not just abstract ideas. These are really, really important ideas for people to wrestle with. So I hope people do pick up and read The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. Matt McManus at the University of Michigan, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. Great talking again.
Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.